Welcome to Cures and Capital, the podcast on value creation in biotech and pharma. I'm Martin.
I'm Simon.
And today we are here with another episode, this time with Scott Berry, President and Senior Statistical Scientist at Berry Consultants. So what can our listeners look forward to in this episode, Simon?
We'll have a great conversation with Scott, and Scott has been designing clinical trials for decades, so he really knows what he's talking about, and his company's approach is different from the dominating approach in pharma, which is the so-called frequentist philosophy. Scott, he's a Bayesian statistician, and we'll get back to what that exactly means. But it's a way to do clinical trials in a way where you can learn as you go. So potentially it's a more efficient way of doing clinical trials. Potentially it's a more efficient way of deploying capital for trials. A key theme will be this innovative trial designs, adaptive trial designs, and then we'll discuss the progress on adoption among the stakeholders out there. Of course, in the companies, why are they not doing more? Should they be doing more? And what about regulators on both sides of the pond at FDA and EMA, and much more. But we'll let Scott explain all that. He's much better at it.
Please subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcast, as it helps us attract new guests. And as always, all views and opinions expressed in the podcast are our own and do not represent that of our employers.
Now, welcome, Scott Berry. So, Scott, thank you for joining the podcast.
I'm glad to be here. Excited.
So, to get us started, could you maybe briefly go over your resume? What have you been doing in your career?
Yeah, sure. I don't know if we have enough time for that. So I am a statistician. I work in the clinical trial space, so I'm a biostatistician. I started off in academia. So I spent 5 years in academia. I actually did quite a bit in sports applications before that was kind of hip now, but started doing clinical trials. And part of my story is my family story. My father is a statistician, and he was at the time at MD Anderson Cancer Center. And I started working with him on some clinical trial design consulting projects, and I loved it. I felt like I was having an impact. There's quite a bit of benefits to be had in the space. And so after doing this for several years, we formed a company, Berry Consultants, and it was the two of us, and it was just over 25 years ago. We've since expanded the size of that, and I've been working on clinical trial design for the last 25 years now. And at Berry Consultants, where we have about 30 scientists, most of them statistical scientists, and we build clinical trials for pharmaceutical companies, medical device companies, federal governments, patient organizations, where there's a hard clinical trial problem. We like to be in that space of innovative trial design.
I think that was very nicely put. And I think our audience here is quite broad. So we'll have probably CFOs and people who are not doing biostatistics on a daily basis. Yep. So could you sort of ground our listeners in some of the key terms you think we should know before we jump in?
Sure. And I will try to not, my role as a statistician and being a good scientist is not asking you to do statistics. We'll do that part, and we'll integrate into that. But my flavor of statistics will be different, and I think it will come as part of this. People may not be aware, but there are different philosophies, and there's Bayesian statistics, there's frequentist statistics, traditional statistics, and when you get only statisticians together, they'll fight vigorously about the best way to do this. And then the question is, what does this mean to people at the end of the day in a trial design, in a particular problem? Does it really sort of matter? And I was trained as a Bayesian, I think as a Bayesian. Now, I live in a frequentist world. The world of clinical trials is a frequentist world. So we function in the Bayesian space and really within this frequentist world, but it's how I think and it's how I attack a problem generally. So those will be words and things we talk about. Now, at the end of the day, does it change the trial design? What does that mean for trial designs is an interesting question.
Yeah, no, I think that is really helpful. And maybe because we'll talk quite a bit about innovative trials, and we often hear adaptive trials, could you just maybe in one or two sentences explain what that is about and what is innovative about it?
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting. Now, CMOs will understand this. I think your listeners will understand this. But I'm asked a lot by people who aren't in the clinical trial space. What is it I do? And I say, well, the standard clinical trial is we make a power calculation and we say you need 300 patients. Go off for 3 years and collect data on 300 patients. And then you look at the data and you find out the answer to your one question. And a lot of times you look at the data and you say, oh, shoot, we kind of ran the wrong trial 3 years later, many millions of dollars later. And you say, I wish the trial would have been smaller. I wish it would have been bigger. I wish we'd enrolled a different patient population, or maybe I wish we used different doses, something we could have done differently, that the trial really wasn't the right trial. And you don't find that out for 3 years later. So we design trials that can move during the course of it. Rather than waiting 3 years, we do analyses during the course of the trial, making sure it's still answering the appropriate questions. Do we need to alter the patient population? Do we need to alter the sample size? Are things learned during the course of the trial that makes it a better trial? Now, what's hard is you say this to people who aren't in the space. They say, boy, I hope you do that in trials. I hope you don't just collect data for 3 years and look at it 3 years later and say, oh, shoot, I hope you're giving us better treatments and you're giving us, better things. But it's really not what's done. So can we make the design better? Now, the Bayesian statistics part sort of feeds into the ability to do that. Is actually a little bit easier, but that's more of the fine details of that. But that's what we're trying to do. Trying to design better trials that answer more and better questions more efficiently.
Yeah. And I think, Scott, you make it sound really obvious that the Bayesian is the way to go. And I'm not sure it's that straightforward. And as we mentioned, that this Thomas Bayes, who gave name to this, and then some other people in the 18th century. And here we are in 2025, and you're still talking about a frequentist world. So what's happened over the last 300 years?
Yeah, it's actually really interesting. In a strange way, Bayesian statistics predates the classical approach that we think of p-values and hypothesis testing. So Thomas Bayes was a 18th century monk, actually, that did various scientific things. His famous paper was published posthumously, and a fellow by the name of Richard Price moved the paper on, finally got it published. And it's a really very, very simple theorem. Interestingly enough, my son is undergraduate in college, and he called me with a problem the other day that was exactly that in his intro to probability problem. And it's sometimes called the theorem of inverse probability. If I'm asked, if I want to know what's the probability of A given B, but I know the opposite, I know the probability of B given A, this theorem allows you to reverse it. And it's a very, very simple mathematical thing, but it forms a whole philosophy about learning that goes into that. I have a certain view of what's the probability this treatment works? What's the probability that it reduces the event rate by 50%? And I collect data, and this theorem allows me to say, now, what is the probability this treatment's effective given this updated data? I get more data, I update it. So it's updating the probability distribution based on what I've learned and updating data. That's as simple. And it was actually used by Laplace. It's been used by others through the years. And it wasn't till Fisher, Ronald Fisher, in really the early 19th century, created a whole philosophy of hypothesis testing, p-values testing, and null hypothesis. And that really dominated. In many ways, it was a computational issue. It's hard to do Bayesian. The computation is harder. The frequentist was easier. And through the years, people have said, should I be a Bayesian or frequentist? And the frequentist largely said, well, it's too hard to be a Bayesian. It's, SAS does all this stuff, but it's computationally harder. And that's the reason not to be Bayesian. Now, with algorithms and computers availability, it's actually very easy to do the computation. So that's gone away. And that was really a 1990s thing. So it's really an interesting thing. And there's a beautiful book, if this interests you at all, called The Theory That Would Never Die,
Mm-hmm.
that goes through these 250 plus years of statistics. And it's really had a huge growth in the last 30 years in all kinds of science problems and in AI, actually, in many things. So it's at a huge renaissance, if you will. And the question is, does it move into clinical trials that are kind of the hardest place to go into with the entrenchment of the frequentist approach within clinical trials?
Yeah, and I think it's, again, you make it sound so obvious, and I guess many people will see, a cardiovascular trial with 30,000 patients over how many years, and you tell me we can do this more gradually. So let's try to break it down and take two companies. So one is completely traditional, 100% frequentist, if that's possible, and the other company is entirely Bayesian. And now we're going to design a phase 2, and we hope to move to phase 3. So how would they do it in their own way?
Yeah, and this is where to separate things a little bit is you can design an innovative adaptive trial being frequentist. You can, so that you don't have to be Bayesian to design an innovative trial. It's a little bit awkward and hard. And the way to think about it a little bit is in a frequentist approach, you kind of analyze this one question in the trial. You can't bring external information into it. It's the calculation. What's the probability this data set is as extreme as it is if the treatment doesn't?
Mm-hmm.
It gets awkward to do multiple interim analyses in that approach. It gets awkward to analyze 5 different patient populations to design a seamless 2-3 trial. So there's a little bit of a difference of innovative design in the Bayesian approach. Now, it turns out a lot of people doing innovative design are using the Bayesian approach. There's a nice synergy of it.
Mm-hmm.
So you might see people doing innovative design tend to attack it from a Bayesian problem. But the game-changing thing to those companies are the trial designs themselves. Do we design a phase 1 trial, wait a year, analyze the data, design a phase 2A trial, fix sample size, run it, and realize, I need to do a different 2 and wait 6 months to analyze the data. Then I start the whole process, design another trial. Or am I designing trials that might be seamless? They go from 1 to 2 in a similar trial, from 2 to 3 with doses. Do I do 2A to 2B? Do I design trials that are adaptive in that and try to get rid of the white space and all of that? It is a huge part of going into the innovative design space. And Bayesian works well in that space. So they're kind of different topics.
Yeah. And then once these two companies, they read out and they issue their press releases, how would they differ? So in one, I guess we have the p-value, and if it's less than something we understand, that's probably a good thing, then you can read it. But how does that press release look for the Bayesian company?
Yeah, and I'm chuckling a little bit because I think people are used to p-values. But if you ask somebody to tell you what it means, they struggle because it's really quite awkward and to get it right. But they're used to it and they've seen it enough that they're comfortable with it. So the Bayesian approach, the readout of it is generally what's the probability that the treatment is effective given the data we saw. It's actually what's stunning about this is that's such a simple thing.
Hey.
But you've been trained as a frequentist that you can't answer that question. So the p-values, what's the probability we would see data like we did if the null was true, which isn't really what's the probability the treatment worked. The final readout of that is a probability like 99.4%. It's 91%, but it's what's the probability the treatment's beneficial. As an example of that, there aren't a whole lot of FDA labels that have posterior probabilities, which are Bayesian driven, as opposed to p-values. And that's the traditional dogma. But there is one. It's Rebiota is a biologic for the treatment of recurrent C. diff. And in the label, it says based on the data, there's a 99.1% probability that the treatment's effective. And so that could be something that's released in a press release. Now, the most important thing of the press release is, did we hit our primary endpoint? And that could be defined on Bayesian or could be defined on frequentist. But the summary will be a posterior probability instead of a p-value.
Yeah. And it seems like people are actually reading the posterior as they wrongly read the p-value, as you phrased it before in some instances. Yeah. So, but then you mentioned the posterior, and if you look up in any statistics textbook, it will, one of the first few pages, you will mention the prior and how that's like a subjective thing. So maybe could you explain what does that mean? Is that just how much flexibility do we have, and what's the problem with that?
And that's the crux of the problem. So I described this originally, that Bayes' theorem is theorem of inverse probability. What's the probability the treatment is effective given the data? You have to have, in order to make that calculation, what we call a prior probability. You have to have a prior probability the treatment's effective. And you need that to make that calculation. So what is the prior probability? And within the Bayesian theorem, Martin and Simon could have different priors. So when you see data, you have different posteriors. So it's thought to be a subjective approach to it. And it's okay that we have different posterior distributions because we come at it with different knowledge. So that becomes an important part of it. Now, it's generally painted by frequentists as a negative, but it can be a powerful, powerful positive thing. And I'll give you a couple examples. And by the way, we do problems where we come into this with very little prior knowledge. You have agreement with a regulator that we're going to use something that is referred to as flat prior, is unopinionated. And if that prior moves to 99%, that's success. So there are cases where it's not really used. And hence the two approaches are pretty similar in that case. But there's other cases now with the advent of external information where that can be brought in through the prior and it becomes a positive. There are other circumstances where the prior is, suppose you go into a trial and you have 4 patient populations that might respond differently to the drug. You can incorporate the prior in what's called a hierarchical model. So they're analyzed together as incorporating information from each, but yet each has a different answer. That comes through the prior. It's a sort of network analysis. This happens in oncology where you take a new drug and you're treating a mutation. And the question is, does this work in GI cancer? Does it work in non-small cell lung cancer, head and neck? And it might have differential efficacy depending on histology. But if it works in one and it works in another, it's more likely to work in the third, or vice versa. If it doesn't work, it's less likely. That can all be incorporated through this prior. So it's actually in drug development, especially with the advent of external information, it becomes a huge positive as opposed to a negative. But it is necessary to specify that ahead of time.
Yeah. I just actually had a question because I'm kind of new to this Bayesian statistics, and you mentioned a strong prior and maybe a more vague prior. Does it somehow affect how big the trial then have to be if you have a strong prior before that?
Well, sure. And let me give you an example of, so this Rebiota that I mentioned, huge challenges enrolling the patient population, and they had enrolled a phase 2 trial that was identical. So the agreement with the FDA was to use the phase 2 information as a prior for phase 3. It did mean that the information needed in phase 3 was less because of that. There are other circumstances. For example, if you go into 4 subsets of a disease that are somewhat related, there are lots of circumstances. It could be severity of disease. It could be forms of epilepsy that have a related mechanism. And if you work in one, you might be more likely to work in another one. And another area is You go in and you show a trial in adults that the drug works, and pediatrics are quite rare. You can't power and run a full trial in pediatrics, but you know it works in adults. So we're going to use that as prior information because we know we have smaller sample size, and it's called borrowing or do that to estimate pediatrics. So there's a lot of circumstances of that. Another common scenario is you run a very large trial. It's not, you don't quite get approval, but boy, it's close. Should you have to run a brand new phase 3 trial starting from ground zero? A frequentist trial only analyzes the new one. Can we incorporate that as a prior potentially? Yeah. So there's a lot of areas where this becomes a positive thing. But yes, in some circumstances, that prior can give you a leg up so that the phase 3 trial or the trial doesn't have to get over the goalpost entirely by itself.
Thank you. That makes sense.
Yeah, and we'll get also back later in the conversation to the take from regulators.
Yep.
But I'll hand it over to you, Martin.
So, Scott, I have a question as a finance person. It would be almost weird if I didn't ask, but for people in an investment committee that are deciding whether to invest into a certain trial or not, why should the investment committees be interested in Bayesian trials? I mean, it sounds like it's really innovative. It sounds like it gives you flexibility. But is there something more they would be interested in?
So I'll generally jump this in as innovative design. Should they be interested in adaptive trials? And a lot of those are run by Bayesian machinery, but absolutely. And even more so now that if you're going to jump into, well, let me back up. If you're in the phase 2 space, you can design a trial that is adaptive. It hones in on a dose. It hones in on the patient population. Rather than running 3 different phase 2 trials, you can try to answer this in one trial. I'll give you an example. Trulicity is Eli Lilly's original GLP-1 inhibitor, diabetes, billion-dollar drug a year, one of their early GLP-1s. They ran a phase 2-3 trial where they started with 7 doses. And you can imagine in a GLP-1 receptor agonist that getting the dose right is really, really important because it's about weight loss, it's about HbA1c, and it's about potential side effects. And if 7 doses in a phase 2 trial, if each one needs 80 patients, that's a big phase 2 trial. So I tend to do only 2 doses because I don't want to do that big of a trial. But if I do 7 doses where the allocation is altered during the course of the trial and it hones in on the right 2 or 3 doses, I can investigate 7 doses with the same resources that 3 in a fixed trial might do. So I can get better answers out of the same resources, time, and cost by doing adaptive than I can a fixed trial that we look at the data in 3 years. And then we've got to figure out the right answers. Phase 3 trials, all of these, we can design much more efficient trials being adaptive than we can fixed.
And can I just ask, I mean, just putting it in the perspective, because I think now you touched upon almost 2 things. So either for the same amount of resources, I can get more out,
Yep.
or I could actually try to get the same answer out for cheaper and faster, right?
Yep.
So there's actually a direct link to the financial value by doing the Bayesian trials.
Yeah, it's optimizing outcomes for your resources for sure, and time and cost of that. Imagine you start a trial. If every trial you have 3 or 4 analyses that are taken seriously for futility, that what's the likelihood this trial is going to be successful? Should we stop it? Your failed trials become much more efficient. You're not running a trial that's dead on arrival halfway through within it. Now, traditionally, this is done by a DSMB and it's about safety and all of that. But now doing this with real thoughtfulness to spending those resources, now maybe I can take more shots on goal because the average cost of trials are smaller and the time is smaller. So if I have 5 drugs rather than investing in only 2, maybe I can address in 4. because my trials are more efficient.
So it's cheaper margin potentially. So I guess the finance folks will like Bayesian statistics and maybe taking it also, keeping it in the decision-making forum. Is it so? I think one thing is if you had maybe facing regulators on the outside, a frequentist design, could you then decide to actually run in-house like a more Bayesian view and then use that just without talking to regulators? Is it possible to use it as a way of updating or continuously updating your view on the trial?
Yeah, so you could be internally as a company using the Bayesian approach, where it's all about your view as a company, the likelihood of success for drugs and treatments, but you're running fairly traditional designs. And you think about this as really a decision problem. I have 27 compounds and I can only invest in 5. Which ones do I invest in? But then once I invest and run the trial, I might run traditional statistical based trials. And a lot of companies are doing this internally. They're doing Bayesian things. And absolutely, every company should have every one of their compounds throughout the development cycle. What's the probability this drug is going to be successful, technical success? What's the expected value of this treatment? And every time I run a new trial or external data is available, this gets updated. And we have a giant ticker, in the business office that keeps track of these, and we can see as a company wide. And then we go after, how do I best learn about or make the decisions about how to move forward next becomes a nice decision problem. So, and that's a very natural Bayesian thing because the prior probabilities are yours as a company.
Yeah.
And they're explicit and you put them down. You don't have to negotiate with a regulator about what's the appropriate prior probability in your internal decision making.
Yeah. And staying with decisions, so you mentioned the probability of technical success, and the frequentist answer is would say the power. And then if we have a phase 3 and the power is 90 or 95%, but we know that historical benchmark for phase 3 are maybe more like 60, 70-ish. So is there a better answer from the Bayesians on this probability of technical success that's more linked to how we design and look at the trials?
Yeah, absolutely. So power is something about the trial. If our effect is delta, we have a 90% chance to be successful. Now, you could even believe delta's right, but you have a huge amount of uncertainty on that delta. And so what a Bayesian would do in that circumstance is integrate over the uncertainty of your treatment effect and the probability of success. And that's kind of a very Bayesian thing, is averaging over the likelihood that our treatment is delta, is 2 delta, half delta. We get an estimate, and that's called assurance in some settings in the Bayesian thing. So that's a much more, what's the probability we're going to be successful by incorporating the uncertainty of it, which is very different than the power of a trial. It's a much more realistic thing. And in some diseases, if you had a 30% chance of success, that a neuroprotectant is effective in stroke, you would invest in that all day long. But it's appropriately incorporating the uncertainty in your decision making.
I think that was a very clear answer. I'll hand it back to you, Martin.
I actually have a question back to this conversation before we switch to another theme, and that is, as you were discussing with Simon, I'm wondering back to the finance mindset and enjoying that it's cheaper. I wonder, is there also a certain benefit, as you were explaining it, designing seamless trials? Could it be argued that, back to the decision-making quality, right? You're essentially allowed to make decisions where you put less money at risk because you are allowed to, over time, as you get more information on it, then you commit more money. So you essentially get rather than getting a big hurdle, now I need to invest $100 million, even though I don't have all the information. Now you can chunk it out, make it more swallowable, right? Or did I misunderstand?
No, I think absolutely. And just to back up the one thing you said, I think it's a more efficient use of the resources. Sometimes it's a bigger trial. That you want the trial to go bigger to hit a clinically meaningful effect, but you know through interims that you have a good chance of success and you don't go there otherwise. So it's using your resources better. The world has changed for us as a consulting company. So we work for a lot of clients, and a lot of biotechs out there they can't run a phase 3 trial, a $50 million phase 3 trial. Now, an investment or another big pharma may not want to jump in and say, here's 50 million, go run phase 3. So a lot of trials now have hurdles to jump. We'll invest 10 million, or the biotech can fund the first 10 million. And if the data at that time point is looking good, sure, we would now invest 40 million because we get proof of concept during the course of the trial. So a lot of trials now are doing financial analyses that trigger funding. And you could do this internally at the pharma company, if you're a big pharma, that, the trial at various time points has to jump a hurdle that it's trending in a good direction. Otherwise, we shut it down. And or it could be that it triggers this additional funding and we don't spend that money unless we get additional information that things are going at least good. It's not a guarantee, but we're jumping those hurdles. Rather than writing a check for 50 million, you write a check for 10, but let's make sure it's going well. Okay, let's write a check for 10 more and make sure it's going. So that kind of thing is an incredibly natural thing within the space.
Now, as a finance person, I've even
Yeah,
more
you're
interested
warming
in
up to the idea. And I have just one quick question, Martin, before you continue. So you mentioned, Scott, also biotech companies, and one thing is, of course, raising for, let's say, a phase 2 trial. But how early can you go with a Bayesian design? So let's say is it first in human and healthy volunteers? Would that make sense? What about phase 1B? I mean, when does it start to make sense?
Yeah, first in human healthy volunteers is rare. By the way, every first in human trial is adaptive. You give the low dose to 8 people, 2 got placebo, and if bad things happen, you stop. Kind of thing. So they're naturally adaptive. But what's generally happening there, you don't need a whole lot of modeling. If you see something bad happen, you stop. You have people looking at that. They are naturally adaptive. They're very, very Bayesian, but not driven quantitatively. They're humans that kind of do that and make a decision that we didn't see anything bad enough. Let's go to the next dose. Now, a different is oncology trials. We do a lot of quantitative dose escalation. They're not healthy volunteers at this point. They are patients, but you're doing dose escalation. And that's because when you see something bad, you don't necessarily stop. You're trying, the mechanism is to do some level of damage, but not too much. Yeah. So we do have models that drive it, and you try to hone in on the right dose that does an appropriate amount, but also looks at benefit. The world of that is all changing with Project Optimus and the FDA wanting better dose optimization. And those are now very much adaptive designs. So usually you're going to get the best bang for the buck, phase 2, phase 2A, phase 2B, for quantitative modeling, quantitative adaptive designs, and then maybe 2, 3, and into 3. First in human are pretty, give it to 3 patients, wait 10 days, wait 20 days. It's hard you can't really go faster. And then there's phase 4, there's comparative effectiveness. There's here in the US, the NIH trying to figure out who should and shouldn't get treatments, which ones are better. All of that is incredibly Bayesian, in a sense.
As you could see, now you also got me excited, and I'm wondering, because it sounds great. But now if you look across biopharma organizations today, where do they stand when it comes to adopting Bayesian trials? I mean, are they widespread, or are there certain hurdles to do this?
Yeah, there's hurdles. It's anytime you do something different, and especially relatively large pharma, they've been doing this for 30, 40 years. They have processes, they have SOPs. The way they do things, the way they interact with the statistician actually is usually late in the game. We know the trial, we know the arms, we know the endpoint, give us the sample size kind of thing. So a lot of it changes, and it's change management to really dive in and do this differently. And so it's just being different. How do we evaluate these? Is there risk because we're doing something different? Now, a lot of adaptive designs de-risk your program, but when you've not done one, it feels risky. That. So a lot of it is just the usual change management stuff, the expertise. People aren't used to doing this. Now I go to operations and I say, wait, we're doing 10 interims in a trial. Wait a minute. I need clean data at 10 points in the trial. Usually I just wait to the end and I clean it once. And so it is moving things in a different direction to do things differently, for sure.
People coming out of the universities today, having studied mathematics, statistics, are they trained as frequentists or Bayesians, or does it vary from country to country, or what's your view on that?
Yeah, it's what's really interesting about it is if you go into a PhD stat program, everybody's trained very much Bayesian. Half of the articles in the Journal of the American Statistical Association are Bayesian. And so lots of Bayesian going on. If you go to biostatistics department, some of those don't have a whole lot of Bayesian as part of it. It kind of depends on the program and the faculty kind of thing. And I went to a school in the 90s that was very Bayesian, Carnegie Mellon. And Duke is known to be more Bayesian than others. And so every school has a little bit of a different flavor. Your advisor has a different flavor. I think biostats has been a little bit slow, and it's been really interesting to watch. So in 2000, 2005, we were doing this. I think academia was actually behind, and pharma was on the forefront of pushing this. It's their money, it's their resources, their innovation. And I think the groups within there were pushing it, where there's even weird things about grant funding for 7 years. Do we want to stop it at 3 years? We're grant funded for. So the whole academic model was a bit different. Now I think it's changed, and academic groups are really, this is innovation. I've seen in the last 10 years, they're leading a lot of this innovation, but it was slow within the biostat group of that. The rest of the world is Bayesian. AI is Bayesian, and people are comfortable with this. And it's pharma, for good reason, that is less Bayesian from it, but that's changing. And we're taping this as we're waiting any minute now for the FDA to drop their draft guidance on Bayesian statistics. It'll be CDRH, the Center for Devices, has one, but CDER-CBER are coming out with one, and it's quite well anticipated for that. So the world is very much changing within that, but it's kind of interesting, the academia, the pharma, and the roles. And actually, I think the US FDA had a lot to do with the innovation and the people that were there, and them kind of pushing. And they see it actually as better trial designs, better treatments, things. And they've been actually at the forefront of pushing innovative design.
Just to put it in perspective a little bit. So I assume, based on what you just said, majority of trials today in pharma are not Bayesian. They are frequentist.
Right.
Yes. Okay, so there's a huge potential upside if we started to switch as an industry.
For sure that. Now, how many are adaptive? And there's simple adaptive. There's one interim analysis kind of thing. And then there's multiple interim analyses, more complicated. Still, most of them are fixed. Most trials are fixed. They're but that's changing quite a bit. And there's lots of parts to it. And pharmaceutical industry is a copycat industry for sure. And we'll talk to a company and they'll say, show me 5 drugs in this disease area that have done this design and have been successful. And they're just, they aren't there. And that's really what is innovative design. It's doing something that hasn't been done before. It doesn't mean it's good or bad, but it hasn't been done a lot before in that. And that's hard in the pharmaceutical industry to kind of do that. So it takes has some perceived risk to do things that are less risky.
Yeah, absolutely. And now you mentioned, give me 5 examples. And I think before you mentioned oncology, but are there any specific case studies or therapeutic areas where adoption has actually really taken off?
Oncology for sure. And Project Optimus, for example, they will regularly, the FDA, when somebody submits, say, you don't know the dose, do an adaptive seamless 2-3 trial. Enroll 2 doses, learn the right dose before you move to the 1-to-1, or run a separate trial and then start phase 3 later. So they're really pushing innovation. Now, other therapeutic areas have oncology envy. Oh, that's oncology. That's different. That kind of thing. That's not our cardiovascular trial. Well, now all of a sudden, cardiovascular trial, obesity trials, very common diseases, stroke. I think it's moving into almost every area. It's rare diseases for sure. And you have to do something different, and it's reflective of that. The hardest area is maybe to make an impact in areas where I can go out and enroll 1,000 patients that all look the same easily.
Okay.
Obesity is one of those. We can enroll 1,000 patients that all look the same and enroll that relatively quickly. And so there's less need to be innovative in that. And so that maybe differentiates the disease area. Now, the promise of an adaptive design is during the course of the trial, you learn something that you didn't know when you started. Had I known that, I would have designed a different trial. That's the whole point of an adaptive design. Areas where information is long in coming are harder to be adaptive. If I don't really find out if the drug's having an effect for 2 years, it's hard to be adaptive in that period of it. So it's not so much the therapeutic area as this time to information to do something in the trial. So that can be a determination of how innovative you can be in your trial design.
Absolutely. And now we are moving a little bit to more practical advice. And me and Simon, we like stereotyping. So we often refer, I'm the finance person, he's the R&D person. So if we start with the R&D people and really the experts sitting in asset teams, the biostatistics, department heads, senior decision makers out there, what advice would you give them when it comes to Bayesian decision making and Bayesian trials?
Yeah, so the biggest part is you need to evaluate different designs. The usual model is they decide this is the endpoint, these are the arms, give me a sample size. Evaluate different designs, compare them. Look at an adaptive design. Look at this time to information quotient for the disease. That's different in the process. You can't go to a statistician with 2 days until we're submitting and ask them to write a section in the protocol. So it is harder to design an adaptive trial. It's hard because you do this sort of, you take candidate designs, you simulate them, you compare them, you come back, you iterate them. You need the time to do that. Now, what comes out of it is a much better design, but it does take longer. It's more effort to do it. And that needs to be integrated within the trial design. It doesn't have to slow you down, but you just need to start and it's part of the process. But evaluate it. Evaluate every design, simulate them, compare them, see what the potential advantages are, what are the potential risks. That's the huge part of this. So you don't have to go in and just the worst thing to do is to specify a complicated adaptive design and just hope it's the right design. And that's a bad idea because a lot of times you didn't realize, oh, this doesn't actually work. We need to do it this way or that way. And that's a little bit different. But through that process, you can get something you can feel completely comfortable. This is going to do everything we want to do at the right time in all of that. But that takes more effort.
And can I ask, Scott, because we want optionality in decision making and having different trial designs as part of that. But you say it takes more time. But let's say I come to you with a frequentist design and I ask you, could you generate some alternatives that are Bayesian? Are we talking days or months or years to do that?
Yeah, right. So that's actually the fun part about that. I think 20 years ago, it might have been, we come back in 4 weeks and show you some alternatives. This can be done in literally hours, but okay, let's do something. We'll next Monday we'll have a call and we'll run through various options of that. Yeah. And what's really important about that is it integrates closely with making sure we understand the goals.
Yeah.
In a fixed trial, you can write down 120 patients, primary endpoint, run the trial. But in this, it's okay, what effects do you want to win by and chase? What effects do you not? What's the minimum sample size? What is success in the trial? So as you start doing these comparisons, you're thinking much deeper than technical success in evaluating the trial. So that's part of it as well. Within it, to make sure it sort of optimizes. Success is much bigger than technical success in that, as to what effect sizes do we want to chase? Do we want to be aggressive, but any negative sign will stop early? Do we want to go to the end no matter what? All of that's part of it within that. But this is now done within days, and that's the beauty of modern computing and modern computation.
So I think that's probably a low-risk way of getting into Bayesian. At least spice up your frequentist design pool with some of the Bayesian design pools. And then it's up to governors to decide if they are maybe ready to try it out. But I think that's very practical.
Yeah, and part of this is we need to make this understandable. We don't want an adaptive design to be a black box.
Yeah.
That we're running it and I have no idea what it's going to do, but I hope it gets the right answer kind of thing. Is you can show people data sets of what happens here. What effect sizes would we stop for futility? When would we continue? When would we open a new indication? When would we trigger another phase 3 to start? I mean, even a simple thing of, do I run 2 phase 3 simultaneously? Do I start one that then triggers another one? What would I trigger? And you show it to them so they understand it, absolutely everything completely about it. It's not a black box at all. And that you started this off with, you're talking to a lot of people that are not a statistician. We don't want them to be a statistician. We don't want them to try to figure this out. We want to show them exactly how it works. They know exactly what they're signing up for and understand how it works.
And maybe again, I can inject another question. So in this process of, communicating, explaining these statistical parts of the decision making, do you think statisticians in biopharma are doing a good enough job in being part of that discussion? I mean, you see teams having, or companies having, teams of decision scientists and all that. And then you have a little bit, the statistician is a person that comes in, gives a 5-minute presentation on 2 slides with some arms and some randomization, and then they leave. But why aren't they more sort of deeper into that decision analysis conversation?
Yeah. So this is a great topic, and it's I feel like, if you're around with your buddy and you say something about your wife, your buddy never says anything. You could criticize your wife, but your buddy's never going to say anything about your wife. So here I can say negative things about statisticians because I am one and I have some of their characteristics. Part of it is the statisticians. We are generally introverted. We generally love to work on our sort of little problem of that and come in and do this. So part of it is the statistician. And what it means is you need to be integrated with the team from the get-go. You need to listen about what they say about the disease, about the endpoints, about the treatment. What is the mechanism of the drug might change entirely what our trial design is, whether a biomarker is critical or not, kind of thing. So you need to be there and you need to be integrated. And when you're presenting solutions, encompass it within the science of everything and you're part of the team. Now, part of it is you have to be invited to it. And part of it is you have to earn the ability to be there, kind of thing. So all of these things kind of go hand in hand. And historically, we've been, and at academic places, for example, we're trying to publish papers. And, we come in and just do a little bit enough to help other people, but we're doing this. But within a team, within a design team, you have to integrate yourself, be part of that. And it does change the way statisticians are involved as much more of a team member, communicating and all of that. So we need to be better. Statisticians need to be better. And we'll earn a role. If we demonstrate that we're really good at this, we get invited back, kind of thing. But recognizing that you need to use the resource that's there, and the statisticians are a great resource. So it's kind of it's a little bit of, is it the dog wagging the tail or the tail wagging the dog? We need this to be better, and statisticians need to be a better part of this for sure.
I'm wondering now, switching the advice to the non-R&D leaders, to maybe the CFOs, the strategy heads, or the investment committees ultimately deciding whether to invest in or not. What would you want them to understand about the Bayesian clinical trials? What would be your advice to them? And now it also sounds like they should just invite their statistician colleague to a coffee chat to better understand what is at hand.
Yeah, that's part of it, but you really have to, it's going to be very hard for that person if I went in and talked about for 10 minutes the philosophical advantages of Bayesian, or you should, I don't think that moves the needle.
Mm.
Showing success, showing wins, you've got to really jump into case studies. Let's do some within that and really mean it, and with your good drugs and do this. But the great thing about it is you don't have to jump into this blindly or riskily. Evaluate this within some of your programs and push the team. Can we be more efficient here? Can we do seamless trials? Can we
Mhm.
put 3 of our drugs with a similar drug? Can we put them in the same trial? You know, and being open to that at the end of that and evaluate that is a huge part. I love the
Mm.
expression that if you look at the drugs we have nowadays and you compare them to 20 and 40 years ago, it's unbelievable. The technical advances in drugs and medicine and our understanding, but we're using the same designs we used 50 years ago. You don't think science and statistics and clinical trials hasn't gotten better, smarter, and all of this? And we're actually at a really neat point because of AI, or the perception of what AI is. We can all argue,
Mhm.
is this AI or what is it? But the ability and the trust for the learning mechanism and the very quickly to learn in who it works and the arms and that drive the next steps. There's more acceptance of this, because we see it's working in that. That kind of thing, I think there's in the next 10 years going to be explosion in innovative designs. There has to be.
Mm.
Mm.
The current model is not sustainable. It's incredibly inefficient.
Yeah.
And now we have the tools and mechanisms for doing this. So largely, don't wait for there to be 5 drugs approved, because you're going to be 10 or 15 years behind.
I really like that answer. So basically, be curious about the different options, not just in funding
Yeah.
options, but also about clinical trial designs.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah.
And now to close this advice topic, I guess regulators here play a big role. As you also mentioned, we still wait until it's widely adopted. Do you have any advice or wishes for the regulators as they think about the future of clinical trial designs?
Yeah. I think, first of all, it's regulators have been falsely blamed for there
Mm.
not being innovation. And I think people look at it and say, well, how come we don't see all these innovative designs? Well, people aren't, pharma's not taking innovative designs. It's not like they're saying no to a bunch of stuff. So I think in some ways they've been blamed for this.
Mm.
Mhm.
In that doesn't mean I don't butt heads or disagree with what regulators say. For largely, I think they do a very good job. They're doing a really good job in all of this. I think they know the world is changing. I think different regions are slightly different. We get different reactions from the US, from PMDA, from the Chinese regulators, from the EMA. It's sort of different. I think the world of separate, big, standalone, simple trials are going away, and they're recognizing it. And I think they're comfortable with it. Some are happily, we're moving this direction for better treatment. So I think the regulators' jobs are going to get harder in that, but also better data from it.
Can I ask, Scott, because you mentioned the FDA guidelines that might come out soon or in draft, and over the summer we had from here across the pond in Europe, we had this ICH 20 or whatever it was called. So, but can you sort of, in one sentence, explain what's the state of regulators in this? I mean, at what level are we? I mean, also if you are, one thing is maybe if you work in regulatory affairs, that's one thing. But if you are like, let's say, in CFO and you're thinking about what is my risk on the regulatory path forward if we do this Bayesian design? Where are regulators? How do you describe sort of what's the temperature and the risk picture?
Yeah. Yeah. So the ICHE 20 is, question is, what is it? It's largely an agreement from everybody, and I'll call it the floor, where almost everything there, everybody agrees, okay. That ICHE 20 differs from FDA guidance documents, but it almost takes the global community to agree to certain things before it makes its way into the ICH stuff in that. Now, that being said, it talks about Bayesian designs. It is ICHE 20 is adaptive designs. It talks about enrichment trials. It talks about seamless trials. It talks about all of these things as adequate and well-controlled phase 3 trials. And so it's all there. I have particularly, I feel like it's slightly negative and overly cautionary within it. Now, what I love about it is there's nothing in there that says I can't do something. And all this, and we probably approach this thing with a different level of aggressiveness, perhaps, but it's not restrictive. All these things are adequate and well controlled. This is welcome for the community. It's hard to look at that and say, "Ooh, we can't do this design," kind of thing. So, but it's in the eye of the beholder, and it's really interesting in that it. So if you go to a regulatory person in a company and you do the company, if you run an innovative design and it fails, you blame the design. If you run a fixed design and it fails, you blame the drug in that. And so that it almost individual risk or team risk to do some. This in the sports world, for example, if you're a manager in a sports and you do something against the grain and you lose the game, it's your fault.
Yeah.
If you go by the book, it's, well, we lost the game and the manager isn't blamed. So there's a little bit of this in design and what design I do and all that. The more and more these documents come out, what it does is this is not the regulators telling you can't do this, within this. And so the field is open.
Yeah.
It's innovation is there. It's all written down. Now, I wish it was a little less sort of cautionary, that people who are on the fence might be pushed backwards based on that. And I think that's a negative, but it's all there.
But as a company, would I be taking more risk if I go Bayesian route versus frequentists? Or is it only perception? You think regulatory risk?
I think it's actually, well, it depends on where you are in all of this sort of thing. You will be taking more risk with a fixed trial. I'm completely convinced that you can compare it mathematically, you can show it. The whole point to an adaptive design is to de-risk it. In going bigger and going smaller is to de-risk it, to start with 2 doses and drop 1 dose. The alternative of that design is you hope you have the right dose and you run a trial. And you get to the end and you say, geez, I wish we'd have done a different dose, kind of thing. So if I can start with 2, adaptive designs are all about de-risk, the whole thing. So just, sticking your hand up in the air and hoping the wind's going that way and you made the right decision, but you committed to this trial of 600 patients in 3 years, that's the risky thing, even though it's been done. It's the risky strategy. And you should evaluate it, you should compare. But that's the ironic thing here. The risk is to do what we keep doing rather than doing a better design.
And then one final question for me. So let's say now we have done the clinical program, we got it approved from regulators, and there's no p-values in our label. And then the next step, we have to take it to payers, market access, that thing. So do we have any view on where do these stakeholders stand in all this?
Yeah, I think they're agnostic to it. Payers for sure. They're not in the game of evaluating the statistical approach or all of that. Now, they may want different information for them to make a decision about cost effectiveness, where your endpoint might be an efficacy endpoint for technical success in a phase 3 trial. They're worried about a secondary or tertiary endpoint about hospitalization or, things. So they may use different measures and all of that, but we've never run into that the particular statistical approach or design is something. Now, something you really want to evaluate if you're running that trial, you don't want to stop because you got technical success if that leaves you short of reimbursement. So the right decision might be, we need to also get to the point that we show this secondary endpoint, that not only do we show this endpoint, but we show some level of feels and functions and all of that that's going to get it reimbursed. That's all part of integrating yourself with the team and making sure you have the right design. So this isn't always about shortcuts. It's about the right solution, the right use of resources. But they're not really in the game of statistical approach either way.
I wonder now a little bit of a prediction. I mean, if this podcast becomes a blockbuster and everyone listens to it and we come back to it in 10 years again, we invite you back. What will we be saying about the role of Bayesian adaptive design in drug development? And I wonder, in the language of statistics, and then you can tell me if I completely misunderstood the concepts here, given what we know today and what we see happening, what is the probability that Bayesian trial designs and adaptive designs will take over in drug development?
I think the hard part of that is what is take over in it. There's no question it'll be done more. And I actually think that it's ripe for, we're an explosion of data. And if you think about a trial design, it only analyzes the data in that trial. There's going to be there's already huge information about the behavior of a control. Think about all the trials we run. We put 50% of all our people on nothing. And we do it over and over and over again.
Yeah.
We know a lot about what happens when you do nothing to somebody. And that data is going to become much more available. 20 years ago, nobody shared data. We didn't know what happened on nothing when you did nothing to them because nobody shared that data. Now, I am not advocating that we lose randomization or we lose control arms, but that data is going to become so available and become part of trial designs. It has to. And we're also learning so much about diseases that they're becoming more and more rare, if you will, that it's not just head and neck cancer. It's mutation type, it's the heterogeneity, and you can't run a phase 3 trial in every little subsets of these. So we have to sort of borrow, we have to learn from these things. And I'll give you one part of this is that we're going to hit a bit of a tipping point, and I think it's going to be an explosion. Almost every other scientific area, this has happened, and Bayesian approaches have somewhat taken over to some extent because it has to. In COVID, platform trials where you put multiple treatments into a single platform, we were a bit of an oddity before COVID, and we were working on a number of them, but there were 4 or something like that. The only way to go after the pandemic were platform trials. Everything we learned about how to treat COVID, not vaccines, but how to therapeutically treat, we learned in platform trials. We accelerated the learning of these adaptive platform trials by 20 years. That eventually we would have gotten there and people would have understood them. Now there's hundreds of platform trials, and we accelerated that learning. And I think that there's going to be that explosion. I mean, guidance document out and all of that. So in 10 years, I think it's going to be an incredibly exciting world of how we learn about medical therapies, what designs look like, what experiments look like. 20 years from now, I think the world will look very, very different. It has to. I mean, we can't keep doing it the way it's just so inefficient, and we're going to be so much smarter on it. So in 10 years, I think the world looks very different, and I think it looks very Bayesian.
That's a very nice and optimistic answer. And I mean, now we are coming towards the traditional ending, but I'm wondering, before we get there, is there anything we didn't discuss that you feel like is very important to mention?
Oh boy, I don't think so. It's been wonderful. The conversation is my favorite topics, even wove in a little bit of sports into it. So no, it's been great.
And we can get to the sports because we have the usual question before we get there, and that is, what have you been reading lately?
Okay.
Is there any interesting recommendation?
I'm a little bit different. So my wife reads a lot of novels, mysteries. I only read nonfiction. I read a lot of historical things. And kind of, interested. I read a book, really good book on a boat called the Wager. And it was a 17th century boat that ended up getting lost, and there was court-martial, and you learn a lot about the historical part. The boys in the boat were a 1930s crew that ended up going to Germany and winning the crew in front of Hitler and all that. But it was the sort of story of the Great Depression, and I like the real story. So two great books, but they tend to be what I read recently.
I think that's I take that recommendation. And in terms of recommendations, I would highly recommend your podcast, Scott. It's called In the Interim. I think it sounds maybe boring as a podcast about statistics, but it's definitely not boring. I can vouch for that, and I enjoy listening to that. I think it's, I mean, and it's, I highly recommend it not only for people, clinicians, whatever, but also for statisticians, because you're superb a communicator around statistics and science. So I highly recommend that. There's a lot of sort of interesting, cool things. I think there was something in one of the episodes around a car with Jimmy Savage and your dad in it. There's a lot of, and I'll leave that as a teaser, and people can try to figure out what exactly that is about. And then there's another thing you mentioned, something called A Statistician Reads the Sports Pages. Do you still write that column, and what is it?
No. So first of all, thank you for the In the Interim plug, and it's been a lot of fun, and it's a great outlet, and I very much enjoy it. When I started in academia, I wrote for Chance Magazine a quarterly article about the world of sports and watching sports, what sports people don't understand about statistics, or bringing a statistical light to those within that. Now I'm trying to do a little bit about A Statistician Reads JAMA. Or reads these articles. And there's a ton of these now about interesting trial designs, interesting results, interesting conclusions. We're in a really weird world of medical conclusions being made. What do the data say? What does it does say? So I'm trying to shift it to that, even though I don't do those columns anymore. I did about 40 of them, and they were great fun. And by the way, the world of sports statistics, from when I was writing those at the end of the 1990s to now, is a world of difference. Every team has their data analytics, every sport. It's big business in that. There were 0 30 years ago, and now it's huge business. You can get a degree in this. The world has changed in sports for sure. If people went back and read my columns, they'd say, wow, this is Stone Age stuff. Because the data wasn't available. It was really hard to get sports data. And I think medicine will see that same explosion when data's everywhere. I'm wearing, you can't see it on here, but I'm wearing a wearable. And
it's a Whoop.
It's a Whoop. And so I have biometrics of how much I sleep, what my energy is, and biometrics of we're going to have this on everybody. What are we going to do with the data?
And I mean, now you touched upon the topic of sports, and you mentioned also before. So do sports and drug development have more in common statistically than we think?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I was once asked to do a course on what drug developers could learn from sports. And I said, sure, I'd be happy to do that. And I put my material together. It was 3 out of that. And I did it just 2 weeks ago at a pharmaceutical company. I did about 45 minutes on what are the parallels of sports applications, which in some ways seems so natural. And then all of a sudden you show, well, this is exactly the same thing in your trial. It's an interesting way to look at these same issues.
Thank you very much, Scott. We will, of course, link to your work discussed today and in our Cures and Capital LinkedIn group. But where can our listeners get in touch with you if they want?
Berryconsultants.com. Go to the website. My email's there. Links to the podcast. Easy to get a hold of me.
Thank you so much, Scott.
That's great.
Thank you both. Very enjoyable.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Take care.
Thanks.
So, Martin, this was our conversation with Scott Berry, and I think a lot of statisticians, they talk about the moment when they are converted from being a frequentist statistician to a Bayesian statistician. So at least now you are a Bayesian finance person. I could see the light in your eyes. So what did you take away from this conversation?
Well, I always knew that statistics is important. Also, very often it can be easily boring. And I think today was quite the opposite. I mean, now I know it's important, and it definitely wasn't boring. It was actually quite interesting when Scott was talking about it. And what I find really interesting is when he was describing the potential benefits of doing this, right? I can see it as a viable lever, how to improve the value creation out of your investment you put into a drug. And sadly, it's something that a traditional finance person wouldn't necessarily look at. I mean, if you try to think of how can you accelerate the value of your drug, you try to do it faster, so recruit more patients. You try to maybe increase the DTC to improve the commercial value. But I very rarely hear, like, can we really explore some innovative trial design? and it might just be the lever that can help. And actually, you can either do it faster or cheaper. I mean, that's a win-win.
Yeah.
How about you?
No, I agree. And just to add to that, I think it's common sense that if your drug candidate is not working, you want to stop as early as possible. You want that information. And if it is working, you also want to know it early so you can adjust your program. And I think it's all the tools, the experience, the history around doing adaptive designs, innovative designs, I think it's all there. So I think for me, at least it boils down to what are these barriers we see within the organizations and maybe the risk-averse behaviors around it. And yes, it is more complicated to do an adaptive trial. At least, setting it up and designing it, it can be a little bit more tricky. But still, as Scott mentioned, that we've been doing it the same way for decades, and we still, put a third or half of the patients on a placebo arm in the trial. So I think that's surprising. And of course, even if you're innovative as a company, I think you don't want to have that perception. Maybe it's real to some extent that there's a regulatory risk or there's a payer risk. But now we see these guidance documents coming out from FDA, EMA, that actually, you can say on some level, is inviting companies, saying this is the stance of us as regulators. We welcome these designs, and of course, maybe you want a more liberal approach to it, and that will come over time. But regulators tend to be conservative, so I think that's, for me, there's no reason not to do it. And I think as humans, I think we basically think as Bayesians, right? If you have an experience, then you update your belief
Hopefully
about me or someone else. It's like, otherwise it's plain stupidity. There's a lot of common sense in it. The math is solid. It works. So I think let's do it. Let's do more of it. And I think, practically speaking, you don't upfront need to commit that you're going to do your phase 3 as an adaptive design, for instance. But at least in the trial design phase, where you will, in any case, evaluate a set of options, both frequentist and potentially a Bayesian. So why not include at least one Bayesian design for every new program where there's some meaning to it? Of course, there's some instances where it does not make sense, but I think that do it, get in the habit, because it's also a competitive edge, because not a lot of companies do it extensively. So if you're in, of course, it's more relevant in some therapeutic areas than other areas, but if you're just close to oncology or neurodegenerative disorders, rare diseases, I think it's a no-brainer.
And I think it was really eye-opening when he mentioned all these potential benefits and then the fact that it really didn't take off yet. And as you mentioned, right, there's a lot of risk in potential adoption also by the regulators, but still in our podcast, right, we have been mentioning declining RNA productivity for at least 10 episodes now. And part of the driver is constantly increasing costs. We keep trying to find and open more sites, and you see problems of sites not even recruiting a single patient, which costs a lot of money. And now, as Scott mentioned, and that was also quite kind of eye-opening, then we put half of those patients that are hard to find on placebo. So not only is it expensive, but then you also kind of waste the potential of it.
Yeah.
There is value in at least trying, and maybe it might just be one of the levers that can help us. It sounds like it fit all the boxes of a productivity equation.
Yeah. But I think this would not be the first time that we discuss conservatism in the biopharma industry. We don't like to do things differently. We like to at least observe that other people do it first, and then we see how did that go? And maybe there's precedent. So now they did it, so now we're gonna follow. And I think it also, we discussed also this, the herding in biopharma and the going for the same drug target, doing things the same way. I think, and it's an illusion to believe that you're taking less risk by doing that. I think that's a complete nonsense
But
attitude to risk.
But I also think it was Scott that mentioned at the end the parallels to sport, right? If you are manager of a team and you try something new and then you fail, it's on you. But if you fail doing it the same way, then it just happened. But I think now, as you said, I think there are already precedents. There are already companies that did it, maybe not in the same disease area, but it has already been shown that it can work. So now the question is, do you want to wait for yet another proof of it or another one and then potentially be the last one to adopt it? Or at what point are you going to update your belief and say, now there is enough proof that it works, let's try it? And I would argue that there has already been a lot of proof that at least in certain areas it works. So why shouldn't it necessarily work in the area you are in?
No, I agree. And I think we just we briefly discussed one example in the conversation, this Rebiota, which is a drug for recurrent C. diff infection. And there's no p-value in the label of that drug, and the p-value is that's the frequentist thing. So that's entirely Bayesian. So, that's an example that it's entirely possible to do this and get drugs approved. Try to get into the habit of doing it. And of course, maybe you need to attract biostatisticians with maybe a more inclination towards the Bayesian view of things. But just imagine now we have the whole data science wave that came, and then the AI wave, and there was if you saw how the entire industry really recruited talent in that area, and I think the return on investment could potentially be even higher because we know this worked. In the biostatistical departments, if you say this is a priority, we want to be leading in adaptive trial designs because we think it's a competitive edge and it's a better way of deploying capital.
We know one thing for fact, right? And that is if we keep doing it the old way, we know where the productivity is heading, right? It's not up.
Yeah.
So we can keep doing that or at least try.
We'd rather fail in a predictable manner, right? Than and I think that comes back to again the coach for the sports team, that you'd rather fail in a well-known way than in a novel way. It's sad, but that's maybe how it works. And I think this Bayesian methodology is so rich because when an investment committee decides on a new trial design, the team explains this is what we expect and this is how we have powered it. So there's a 90% power in this trial. And then I think, especially if maybe you're not from the R&D side, maybe let's say from finance, maybe what's the power of a trial? It seems maybe that you hear that there's a 90% chance of succeeding. So it's a good bet. And I think the Bayesian methodology is a much better way of accommodating the real view on how you see success in a trial. So it actually gives you a more realistic estimate of the probability of success, because you can sort of make the success definition more granular and also capture the uncertainty. The frequentist way has a lot of simple assumptions, you could say, so it doesn't capture that uncertainty. So we know that, probability of success in phase 3 is not 95%. So we know that number is just a technical specification for the trial, but doesn't tell you how likely you are to succeed in it. It's not the number you put into your business case or whatever. So I think that's the reason that finance folks should also be interested in this approach.
And here I think it's important, right, when you go into an investment board, and maybe sometimes the investment board are maybe people who don't have a statistical background or the scientific background, that I think it's really important that different departments come together to really show the holistic value of it, because it can also easily happen that people come there and tell you all the exciting stuff about the statistics, but you don't really capture the attention of the investment board. It needs to be holistically communicated, because then you might actually capture the attention of the board, and that might just make them try to do the move, right? I think it's very important to put it holistically.
And I think maybe a final comment from my side is that I think that's all about also bringing statisticians into the governance meetings, because everyone talks about decision quality and you need a team of decision scientists, and that's great if they can facilitate workshops and make decision trees. But remember that the statisticians, they are, at least all the statisticians I've met, they are all very clever, and they're just basically taking common sense and turning it into numbers. So exploit statisticians much more in the decision-making process, because it's they have a very rational and pragmatic attitude to these things. So maybe there's that untapped potential out there in the organizations. We'll bring statisticians into the meeting rooms and have them explain in more depth, and of course also demand from them that they actually explain it in a manner so everyone understands where they're going.
So I think, Simon, this is a great ending, because we can, as always, say maybe just invite the statistician in your company for a coffee chat.
Do that. They're all very they're great people. They're not boring, as some would say. Or maybe they're very hidden, those few of them, but so it is. So invite them for coffee. And I think with that, I'm happy to wrap it up.
So thank you very much for listening. And as always, please don't forget to subscribe. But also, if you feel like you have a guest you would like to listen to, or you would like to bring a thought in, just participate in our LinkedIn group, put your thoughts in, and also share who would you like to listen to. And we can always try to reach out to them.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.